Welcome, everyone, to another episode of U.S.-China Dialogue, the show where myself and Professor Chen Dingding, hi Dingding, we convene groups of U.S. and Chinese experts to talk about various issues and the relationship. Dingding, it's so nice to see you again. It's been a while since we've seen each other.
Yes, it's been a long while, so it's exciting to see you again and the others.
You know, every time we do one of these, there's something happening in terms of the landscape of U.S.-China relations that's worth mentioning at the outset. And among the different things that are happening now is that Xi Jinping is going abroad for the first time, going to Kazakhstan. So that seems fairly significant. And of course, we're expecting him to perhaps meet with President Putin in Kazakhstan, but then also there's this idea that he's going to attend the G20 meeting and meet with President Joe Biden in November. So there's a lot of international travel ahead for President Xi Jinping.
You're right. It's very important that our President Xi Jinping is visiting a foreign country for the first time since the pandemic. So it's possibly a signal that in the near future, some new measures will be rolled out in terms of international traveling for ordinary people as well.
What do you foresee in terms of the meetings that he has in Kazakhstan and then the meeting with Joe Biden in November?
Well, these are the two maybe most important meetings for the leaders from these three countries in the next 2 or 3 months or the remainder of this year. So I'm sure they will be talking about very big issues like the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the U.S.-China negotiations regarding trade and so on. But we still need to wait for November, especially the midterm election results from the U.S. But I think it's okay to remain a little bit positive on the outcomes this year.
Well, you say the midterm election, there's another political event happening soon too, which is the 20th Party Congress in mid-October.
Right.
So that, of course, will have a lot of significance for China domestically, but perhaps also for the U.S.-China relationship going forward.
Right. Those are the events we all look forward to discussing.
Well, we will have lots and more opportunities to talk about that. You know, the thing that we wanted to talk to our group today about is the topic of regional economic integration, which is something that is both part of U.S.-China competition, but also maybe an avenue for the U.S. and China to find some cooperative dimensions going forward, although I think probably the competitive aspects are clearer right now.
Yeah, this I agree completely. This regional economic integration is of very significance, and we are glad we have excellent scholars from both sides. Now let's bring them up.
Great to see everyone.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, so let's first introduce our American scholars. First, we have Professor Gregory Shaffer, who is a Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science, and also the Director of the Center on Globalization, Law and Society at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. He's also the President of the American Society of International Law. And next, we have Wendy Keller, who is Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and also the Managing Director of the Washington, D.C. office. And she focuses on building ASPI's presence in the nation's capital and on leading initiatives that address challenges related to trade, investment, and innovation, as well as women's empowerment in Asia. Welcome, Greg and Wendy.
Wonderful to have you both. And we're also very delighted to have Professor Yong from Peking University, where he's the professor at the School of International Studies and the director of the Center for International Political Economy, and also the director of the Center for American Studies. He's also a professor at the Party School of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, and he's on the editorial board of the Journal of Review of International Political Economy, the Journal of Global Asia, the Journal of Global Governance, the Journal of Contemporary Politics, and the Journal of Human Security. We're absolutely delighted to have you with us, Professor Yong.
Thank you.
And we're especially delighted as well to have joining us Professor Min Ye, who's Associate Professor of International Relations at the Party School of Global Studies at Boston University, where her research situates in the nexus between domestic and global politics and the intersection of economics and security with a focus on China, India, and regional relations. Her publications include the recent book published with Cambridge University Press in 2020, The Belt, Road, and Beyond, State Mobilized Globalization in China, 1998 to 2018. She is, I think, one of the world's leading experts on the Belt and Road Initiative and regional integration through that, and we could not be more delighted to have her with us today. Great to have you, Min Ye. So let's jump into the conversation. The first thing we thought that might be useful to establish is some kind of conceptual clarity about our topic today of regional economic integration. What exactly does that concept mean? How does it relate to the way we think about multilateral trade institutions generally and the WTO? So let's maybe do an initial round of responses on this point. I think I'm going to ask Greg to go first and help clarify for us and for our wider audience, what exactly are we talking about today when we're talking about regional economic integration?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Neysun and Dingding for inviting me. When we talk about regional economic integration, it occurs when barriers to trade and the factors of production are diminished or eliminated. Economists, going back to Bella Balassa, speak of stages of economic integration, such as a free trade agreement where you eliminate tariffs, a customs union where you do that, but you also create common external tariffs, a common market where you eliminate barriers to flows of not only goods, but also services, capital, and labor, and an economic union where you have a common currency and other measures. And to put this in sort of practical context, there are three major regional blocs today that vary in their economic integration. They are North America, Europe, and Asia. Europe is the furthest along in economic integration, particularly with the integration of West, East, and Central Europe in a common market with a common currency in the Eurozone and many harmonized regulations. North America, we had NAFTA, now we have the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. That is a free trade agreement. It's not a customs union. There's no common external tariff, and it's not a common market, much less an integrated market with a common currency. Asia, as we'll see, involves a competitive network of free trade agreements, regional agreements, most notably the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, with China, and the CPTPP, which is a substitute or successor of the TPP after the US dropped out. And now we have the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is just getting discussed. To put this into context, is WTO sort of multilateral negotiations stalemated, the US started to engage much more intensively in the early 2000s in free trade agreement negotiations. And other countries followed suit. China was a little bit later to the game, but it's become much more engaged in signing bilateral investment treaties, free trade agreements, and now RCEP. It's regional agreements that are particularly important because of the network effects, especially through regional supply chains, which then tie into global trade.
That's great. Thanks, Greg. I want to see what others want to say about this initial conceptual point. Maybe so we can alternate between American and Chinese. I'll see if Professor Yong, if you would like to say something, and a couple of things from the initial presentation by Greg that I want us to maybe kind of clarify include harmonization of regulations, and also this notion of supply chains that was at the end of Greg's comment now, and anything else that you think is important for us to mention at this outset.
Okay, I think Gregory has made a great summary of the concept and the related developments of regional economic integrations. So I think has become a very common phenomenon right? So for the countries to cooperate with each other, okay, try to develop the closer economic and trade cooperations, right? So that is especially after the 1997, 1998, the so-called Asian financial crisis. That's been more true. So in the Asia Pacific regions, right? So I think that is the countries pursue the regional economic integrations as some responses for the rising risks of the global economic globalizations. So the flow of capital across borders, right? So since the end of the Cold War, right? So China, China used to be right, so left behind. All the whole Asia have been, used to be left behind in this regard. In the regional economic innovations, but after the Asian financial crisis, right, the most of all the countries in the regions recognized it's very important to work together and to help each other to prevent the occurrence of the the financial crisis or the other crisis might be coming to them.
Wendy, you are a long-time trade negotiator. You probably spent a good, huge chunk of your career thinking through how to advance agreements to strengthen regional economic integration with respect to different parts of the world. What is your bird's eye view of this topic and why it's important and how it fits with broader trade issues?
Yeah, and I'm just building on what the previous speaker said. I couldn't agree more that regional economic efforts really intensified once it became clear that the WTO was not able to deliver the kind of results that many countries were looking for in terms of further trade and investment liberalization. And that kind of led the United States to really focus on a region of the world where there's just a lot of economic activity, innovation, and supply chain connectivity. So I think it's important as we discuss this issue to emphasize that this is a region, it's kind of where it's at economically. So these efforts are incredibly important. Different countries are pursuing kind of different efforts in the region, and how this all plays out is something I'm sure we're going to be getting to over the next hour or so. I would also just build on one thing that Greg said. When I think of regional economic integration, I think some of it, yes, is about bringing down barriers between all of the members, but I also think it's about creating rules to govern the trade and investment between the parties to those agreements. And for the United States in particular, under the Biden administration, it's the rules part of these regional efforts that are becoming more and more important, with the market access part becoming kind of less important. And frankly, permeating all of this is something I'm sure we'll get into, is just the supply chain connectivity, that you cannot underestimate the importance of these regional economic agreements for promoting, solidifying, and strengthening supply chains.
That's great, Wendy. And just before I go to Minye, I wonder if, Wendy, you could just say maybe one or two additional sentences about the WTO and how it fits into this. You already did build on Greg's point earlier about sort of the deficiencies of the WTO, but I wonder if your last point about how, especially the Biden administration is moving towards more of a rules approach rather than market access, doesn't that feel a little like sort of what I understand to be the WTO notion of things? Is that, what's the way in which the way these things are being discussed at the regional level relate to the way in which we've discussed the WTO and its regime?
Well, yeah, I mean, the short answer would be that the WTO, yes, I mean, it's all about market access and rules, but in both areas, it's been unable to deliver results, particularly as membership has expanded. you know, from an economic point of view, it's great. You want to do this all multilaterally if you can. That would be the perfect solution. But if that doesn't work, then you have to look to, well, what do we do if the WTO members together can't come together and advance, you know, rules and address new issues and improve market access? And that's where these regional efforts come into play.
Greg, I saw you nodding, so I think you might, I don't know if you want to add a word on that.
Sure. I mean, Wendy makes an excellent point. I mean, what's being captured is that this is a form of deeper integration. You know, these regional agreements involve much deeper integration because they go behind the border to address regulations. If you think of the European Union, they have, you know, standards with respect about everything, including labor. And you see this in the USMCA sort of moving towards including sort of concerns about labor, the environment, and so forth, which has simply been impossible to negotiate at the WTO. And so if one to have this form of deeper regulation where one talks about common regulations and concerns about such matters as labor, environment, it's happening in bilateral and regional trade agreements.
So one last broad question here to Min-Ye before I pass the ball over to Dingding for our next round of questions. So Min-Ye, you've focused especially in your research on economic integration in Asia. And you've thought not only about China, but India and other countries in the region. So I wonder if there's anything particular to the Asian story of regional economic integration that you think is worth mentioning at this initial phase of our conversation.
Yeah, I think the dynamics of Asian regionalism is quite different from the European and North Atlantic process. So for example, in the Asian regionalism negotiation, the focus is less on harmonization and standardization. And it's more about building linkages, opening. Right? So in following the 1998 Asian financial crisis, the whole regional integration thrive on different terms, different rules, and different irreciprocal opening across different countries. So when we, as Asianists, when we look at regionalism, we typically think of the process along two levels. One is bottom-up regionalization. So the increasing exchange, communication, regionalization of people, goods, information, and services, right? And then you have a regionalism, which is led by government-led efforts. And then the details are often shaped by how the geostrategic situations unravel and how the business and other think tanks are involved. So the ideational aspects of it. I think that nowadays, so although for the long time, regionalism and regionalization, Asia has been mutually reinforcing. But at critical moments when geopolitical competition is very intense, they go out of line. So 2007, 2008, when China, Japan was heatedly competing, and regionalism and regionalization actually diverged, so to the detriment of regional integration. And currently, because of US-China are intensely competing, so the regionalism actually is acting against the regionalization. So I wonder over time, when regionalization becomes thinner, the shared interests, shared ideas are thinning, then what the regionalism, the future will be very concerning.
Okay, thank you, Neysun, and all of our speakers for a very nice discussion of the concepts and the conceptual frameworks. Now let's shift to more specific topic, the U.S.-China relations. So I want to ask Professor Yong from Peking University. So in your view, what is the regional economic integration idea playing now in U.S.-China relations? Of course, we have a lot of competition going on between the two countries. They have both proposed different frameworks of regional economic integration. So how do you see this competition? Of course, it's not just limited to economics, but also including securities and other items. So Professor Wang Yong.
Yes, thank you, Dingding, for your great question. Yeah, I think before I comes to this part, okay, on the U.S.-China competition, in the regional economic integration line, right? We have to recognize U.S.-China has a very complicated relations. So they both sides become the major trading partners to each other. If we count by country, not by a group of countries, okay, the United States is still the largest trading partners to China, and China counted as the second largest trading partner to the United States, right? So both sides have a very deep, very wide trade, investment, financial relations. Okay, you might remember that, okay, around the time of global financial crisis. In the 2008, people are talking about so-called, China America, right? So the mixed economy of the U.S.-China. Now the people, some people, started talking about economic decoupling between U.S. and China. So I think for those people, they have to recognize, okay, that is the close economic relation between U.S. and China. So I think that is, in my view, that is in the mutual interests of the people of the two countries. Both sides benefit from these relations greatly. But it comes to that topic, right? The U.S.-China, policy and roles in the economic, the regional economic integrations. We see, the competition and some corporations, even sometimes, right? Seemingly, that is kind of competitive relations can turn into, the economic corporations, right? For examples, okay, that is so-called, the competing regional liberalizations, right? So, China, is still a developing country. United States is the largest developed countries. Both, the either side, of course, is for understandable reasons, has a different, goals, a different standard about how to pursue, the regional economic corporations, okay, in the Asia Pacific, for examples, right? So before, President Trump came to power, we have seen that is a different arrangement, different of negotiations. For example, the U.S. pursuing the highest standard, the trade liberalizations, okay, in the framework of the TPP. Right, so when the Trump came to power, it tries to withdraw its membership from the TPP, which later on had become the CPTPP. Right, that is still high standard, especially in matters of labor and environmental protections. Right. On the other hand, China and most of the Asian economies, right, they choose the standard not so high. Okay, now it's called RCEP. Which is called the regional close economic the partnership, right? That is, you have it has 15 the members. It is India usually attended the negotiation, but in the last minute, right, the Indian government decided to quit the negotiations. So that is RCEP with the standard so high. That is more, to the members find it more comfortable, okay, to join and open up the market, in other facing, the facing arrangements. Okay, that is very good. To them. But on the other hand, I will say, right? So especially in the recent years, regional economic integration has become the instrument of the geopolitical the games among the big powers, especially United States and China. Now, United States, why they find it unrealistic to come back to the CPTPP or TPP, right? Because of domestic politics. Now the U.S. comes to the idea of the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Okay, that is very clear in the U.S. minds. Okay, that is competing with China. Okay, try to limit the China's regional influence. Okay, in the Asia Pacific, and China now is very interesting to like China.
Right. So I think Professor Wang, you raised a very important point. That is maybe because of a U.S.-China competition, that's why we are seeing so many different conceptual frameworks, right? Whether successful or not, TPP, CPTPP, and RCEP, IPEF, DEPA, so on and so forth. So Wendy, do you agree with this view? It's really because of U.S.-China competition that we are seeing so many different forms, or are there other forces out there also contributing to these various frameworks? How do we reconcile these two different views?
Well, I agree that U.S.-China competition has had an impact on the development of these initiatives, but I don't think it's the sole factor. I mean, I think again we should recall what we were discussing 15 minutes ago. Why did regional economic integration efforts, get underway, a number of years ago? And that, in my view, had more to do with the WTO not producing the results and the WTO being incapable of providing the rules and the forum for advancing trade, investment liberalization, and frankly, rules to address new issues. So for the United States, looking at that, we concluded a number of bilateral FTAs, but then we joined with other countries to launch the TPP negotiations, which were successfully concluded in 2015. The RCEP negotiations that Yong mentioned, they were launched, during that same time frame with some ups and downs as well. And now we have the IPEF framework, which was just launched by the Biden administration in the past year. But, again, I think U.S.-China competition has an impact and influence on all of this, but it was just not the motivating force. And I just would take issue with Wang Yang's characterization of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I mean, I think if China's viewing this as like an anti-China forum that was, cooked up by the United States to isolate China or to somehow, rally other countries against China, it's not looking at the actual agenda and the negotiating objectives of this grouping. And frankly, there's overlapping membership of all of these groups, okay, and negotiations. And so countries, they don't have to say, we're joining the IPEF, but we're not going to be in TPP or RCEP. In fact, most Asian countries, or many Asian countries, I think all the Asian countries that are members of CPTPP are also members of IPEF and RCEP. So, to just look at this through the lens of U.S.-China cooperation, I think is misleading and, not the right way to assess or analyze or, talk about these regional groupings.
Dingding, can I jump in very briefly before you ask your next question, just to ask a follow-up of Wendy. So, my sense is that perhaps a position could be that why the different countries in the region who are joining the IPEF framework are not specific to their feelings about containing China. From the US standpoint, there is this sort of concept of the Indo-Pacific that is, I think, fairly understood as being part of an overall effort to rally the region in ways that are maybe thinking about China, whether we want to say very robust language or less robust language. And isn't the IPEF at least a little bit part of that? I mean, is it really the case that it has, like, the IPEF, as far as the US is concerned, has nothing to do with sort of being competitive vis-a-vis China in the region?
Like, look, I agree to say it has nothing to do with it. Of course, anything we do in the region, we're thinking of China, and anything China does in the region, they're thinking of the United States. We're the two largest economies. We're, as Yong mentioned, we have, our serious differences on our vision of the region and the world. And so, yeah, that, it's there. But again, what I want to emphasize, when the United States looks at the region, our view is this is a region we need to be economically engaged in for our own reasons, okay? The region is where the growth is. The region is where the innovation is. The region is where the new ideas are. The region is where the populations are growing. And so, that's kind of, a motivating factor for the United States. And then when we say we want to be economically engaged, then we start thinking, what's important for us in the region, along with other like-minded countries that might share our view of the importance of transparency, of the importance of, market forces, of the importance of diversifying supply chains. And so, yeah, we come up with proposals in all of these areas. China's on our mind, but frankly, we have an affirmative agenda, a positive vision, and that cannot be discounted as we shape, the IPEF, or frankly, as we shaped TPP 10 years ago or so.
Okay, Wendy, I really appreciate your insights, and I agree with a lot of what you just said. But now let's turn to another dimension of this question, Greg. US-China competition might be a major source of what we are seeing in Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, whatever. But on the other hand, would these regional economic integration projects in the future contribute to more US-China competition, or ironically, more US-China cooperation, right? Because you look at the picture right now, China is trying to join CPTPP. The US is not interested at the moment, but who knows, maybe 2-3 years later, 4 years later, US will think again, right? And China is not, in theory, Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, excluded from IPEF, right? IPEF theoretically should be open to China as well. So US, China, the two biggest economies, at least in this region in the world, where somehow, they're still trading with each other, they're still, doing financial cooperation one way or another. So there's no way, all these frameworks can be only US club or China club. So how do you see that picture?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. I mean, obviously, there's both competition, but also real opening up of prospects for cooperation. So if you think about it, the pivot to Asia, the Obama administration, and the focus on the TPP, clearly there is a China component to that. And paradoxically, in my view, that actually motivated and incentivized China to get much more engaged with RCEP, leading to the conclusion of RCEP. And of course, China's conclusion of the RCEP, we use lots of acronyms, but this is the China-based sort of free trade agreement, the largest free trade agreement now in the world, or say China's the largest market within that particular free trade agreement. That clearly has had a motivation for the Biden administration coming up with the strategy of IPEF. So that exists. But what you pointed out was the mere fact that the TPP, now the CPTPP, China has applied to become a member to it, that shows that there's real possibility for normative sort of concordance and for cooperation. And I think it's very important not to see all of this in terms of a Cold War zero-sum game of competition. It's not that. It's trying to reimagine what type of international economic law system we should have. The Biden administration is putting forth a vision which is based on resilience, which is based on sustainability, which is based on social inclusion. Those are all important normative frameworks, which in my view are important for China as well. And so I could very well see aspects of IPEF that would be of great interest for China down the road. So I think it's a mistake, this sort of reductive, sort of neo-realist sort of perspective of everything can be reduced to a US-China competition. This is very much about what sort of international economic law normative framework do we wish to have and live within.
Yes, Greg, I very much agree with you. And it's also not only reducing everything to US-China competition, it's not even reducing everything to US and China, right? Remember, this vast region, you also have Japan being a major economy. You also have India trying to propose its own rules and the sort of order, regional order. So Professor Ye, how do you see these US-China players, very significantly, including Australia? They also play a role in all this original economic integration or regional integration. How do you see their roles in all of this?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And again, all the three speakers, the rational logic I'm familiar and really agree with. And this also shows in the real world, and competing logic actually coexist and they all apply to the same outcome. I think one thing is I noticed that the continuity in the great power or US-China competition in regionalism and also some change in the current phase. The continuity is in Asia, security concern and economic concern, they coexist. And this is very different from European experience, but they resolved geopolitical territorial conflicts, then they get on their institution building. Asia never resolved geopolitical frictions, disputes. So China's relationship with its neighbors are more difficult, more contested, more dangerous than its relationship with the United States. And yet in Asia, economic, the regionalization has taken place very significantly, as Wendy noticed. Right? This is the area that has the most dynamic growth in the previous 4 decades and perhaps will continue in the future decades. So because of that, the continuity is, I don't think Asianists would be surprised that geopolitical competition is a driver of regionalism, and then regionalization is a product of geopolitical competition. But there is something different from the TPP to the current IPEF. So I studied the TPP process systematically over those years. So I know when TPP was proposed, and there was a very, and the Chinese, of course, like today's Chinese, reacted to that as containment, US-led containment. But then there was earnest efforts by Asian capitals, Asian countries and governments, as well as the US agents to explain to China that this is not the case. And so, and the Chinese delegates also came to the United States. So from 2012 to 2014, the US basically said openly that we welcome China to join, and the Chinese said we will join sooner or later. Right? So that kind of efforts, communications between the two countries, as well as the involvement Asian capitals are much more salient in today's IPEF negotiation. So I agree. When we look at the contents of IPEF, perhaps China is doing something similar, and will get its inspiration from the efforts and negotiation, but they largely, both sides viewed this as a competitive mechanism rather than an integration mechanism. So I'm a little bit concerned that in particular, if Asians, because if the great power competition gets too much, right? So we like competition, but when it gets too much, then the voices of middle power and the efforts of persuasion, communication, accommodation kind of got lost. Then the competitive cooperation mechanism might not work in Asia's future. So the division voices will override. And that's the concern that I have. I mean, Asianists are used to having competition, having security concerns, and yet also enjoy integration. But over time, we don't know. So the Asia-centric is under shadow, in my opinion.
So in this great conversation so far, we've started at maybe an abstract level, and then we've started to get a little bit more specific in talking about these competitive, potentially dynamics. Why don't we really drill into each of these different acronyms we've been throwing around, whether it's RCEP or BRI or TPP, CPTPP, IPEF. I want to talk now a little bit about what these various frameworks specifically entail, what all of you think are most important about each one. And you don't all have to talk about each of the acronyms, but maybe we can, over the course of a few different responses from all of you, help our audience really understand each of these things. And maybe a good place to start is with TPP. And Wendy, since you were so deeply involved in the negotiations of TPP, and of course have been following the evolution to CPTPP, maybe I could invite you to go first and help us understand what exactly you and the US negotiating team was trying to achieve with TPP, how you think that ended up falling apart from the US side, and what is the way in which CPTPP is potentially carrying forward now that the US is not as involved.
So yeah, so starting with TPP, first, I think it's important for the audience to know that the United States didn't dream up TPP. We actually joined 4 other countries that had concluded the P4 negotiation, and hopefully I can remember the 4, someone can help me, but it was New Zealand, Chile, Singapore, and Brunei. And then we joined their negotiation in 2009. And, you know, at the time when Australia, Malaysia, and Vietnam also joined, and then a couple of years later, Japan, Canada, and Mexico joined. And I forgot Peru joined somewhere in there in that time frame as well. So you basically had 12 countries in what was kind of a US-led negotiation. And, you know, what was the United States seeking? Again, we were looking at the failure of the Doha round. We were looking at the region, not just in economic terms, but, you know, part of the Obama framework was making this kind of pivot to Asia and wanted a strong economic leg. And we also wanted to kind of further the rules, again, to address new issues, and also to kind of reflect our vision of the region in terms of principles of transparency, non-discrimination, etc. Interestingly enough, when we left the negotiation under the Trump administration, other countries were shocked, okay? Because even though they watched our presidential campaign, they had a really hard time understanding how could we leave in an agreement where, frankly, other countries were coming up to our standards. We had very little to change ourselves. But nevertheless, I think the United States, and as one of the negotiators of TPP, I'll be the first to admit it, we kind of lost sight of the public, of growing public sentiment against trade and trade agreements globally in the region, et cetera. And so by the time we brought this agreement, when we finished it and we brought it home, it was a very different United States than it was when we launched the negotiations in 2009. Now, the other countries, again, shocked. And I remember Prime Minister Abe within like 2 months saying, TPP without the United States is meaningless. A few months after that, Japan was rallying the other countries to conclude the deal without us. And actually what shocked me the most was not that the other 11 countries concluded the deal without us, but they kept the overwhelming majority of that agreement intact. They changed very little. And so the CPTPP agreement that's in place now between those 11 countries, the agreement that, the UK, China, other countries now have applied to join, really reflects kind of a US, led agreement reflecting US proposals. And so that's how I view the TPP, which has become the CPTPP. Now, the RCEP, which we've been talking about, is an agreement, again, focused just on Asia, so no countries from North and Latin America. But in terms of the Asian countries, all Asian countries that are members of CPTPP are also members of RCEP. And the way I look at RCEP is it's kind of a TPP light. In other words, a lot of the same chapters, but the commitments aren't as deep. There are a lot of exceptions, long transition periods, and in terms of market access, just not as deep as the market access that was agreed to by the TPP members. Nevertheless, I think RCEP is meaningful. It's an ASEAN-based agreement, and I would just, for our viewers, just remind everyone that while many people have tried to kind of say US TPP, China RCEP, competition, this was an ASEAN-based agreement that China joined. And as an ASEAN-based agreement, I expect that improvements and additions and new features will be added over time as well. So the standard their standards will rise over time. And then, and I know I've been talking for a long time, the way I view IPEF is the US re-engagement in the region with the recognition and understanding that because of our own politics, we cannot do a big trade agreement right now. So what we have developed, what the Biden administration has developed, is an economic initiative. It's not a trade agreement. Trade is one part of this agreement, but the IPEF initiative, importantly, not only covers trade, but also covers the important and pressing issues of the region, including supply chain resiliency, decarbonization efforts, clean energy, and anti-corruption. So it's important when you think of IPEF, don't think of it as a trade agreement. It's not a trade agreement. It has a trade component, but it's much broader than that. And moreover, unlike RCEP and TPP, it does not include tariff reduction. It does not include, its main feature is not providing additional market access through tariff cuts and services commitments to other countries. That's something that the Biden administration is just not willing to do at this juncture. Maybe that will change with time. I think it will. But as a first step, it's focused on, again, trade, but also other pressing economic issues facing the region. So that's my primer.
That's great. That's a great primer. And we can ask everyone to kind of build off of that. Maybe next, Yong, how does that way that Wendy laid out, the TPP, CPTPP, RCEP, IPEF, how does that resonate with you in China? Do you think that the RCEP is more like the TPP or maybe more like the IPEF? And does China want to potentially join the CPTPP? How would that be different from what it's trying to do with RCEP? And would China be interested in joining the IPEF? What does it all look like to you from Beijing?
Yes, Neysun, I think you they give me a very the interesting perspective on the China approach to the regional economic integrations. Yeah, I would like to see that very interesting to look at China's statement on the regional economic integrations. So the China welcomed any forms, right? So regional economic cooperation arrangement, right? That means so that is can ensure the market opening, right? Is to promote the economic cooperations of the economies. Okay, that is either the TPP, like all the other the RCEP or any other the arrangements. Okay, China will welcome. So I think that is a very, very important and valuable approach. So for the countries, for the politicians, you try to understand China. So I suggest to look at this such kind of statement. Secondly, I think China now it has been joined the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Right, so as the Wendy well said, right? So China's joined the RCEP. Right, the China the major driver of RCEP RCEP is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, right? Rather than China. I think that is they can help the people, especially. The concern about the security and the implications of RCEP, right? It's not China driving that. By China, the RCEP it has been implemented, this year. That means after some times, the members RCEP, will build the largest, the trading bloc in the world. That is very important. Larger than the EU, like than the North is North America, right? So and the another point I think deserves mentioning. It is China has applied for the membership of the CPTPP, right? So why? So that is on one hand, China think the higher standard, the CPTPP, can help China's domestic reform, economic reform, especially with regarding the part of the state-owned enterprises, because the CPTPP or the TPP emphasize principles of the competition neutrality, right? So that help China's domestic reform agenda. Another thing, China think that to join such a kind of things will help to improve the political economic relations with all the membership, to help to calm down the geopolitical tension. Very important. So I think for China has been openly minded. If the United States is interested to joining the RCEP or the other reform, other the proposals of the arrangement of corporations, for example, like the AIIB. That would be a great idea. China welcome the US.
Wang, you said something now that I can't resist asking you a follow-up. You talked about how maybe joining a framework like CPTPP could help China in its domestic reform agenda. And of course, that reminds me of some literature, including a recent book by Professor Yeling Tan about the accession to the WTO and how Chinese domestic reformers were able to use that mechanism to push forward some things that they wanted to do in China in the 90s and 2000s. Is that still a dynamic? Is that still something that you could foresee that there is a reform constituency that sees the connection to these international bodies as a way to help push through some of the vested interests in terms of whether it's SOE reform or something else?
Right. Yes. The WTO, right? So has produced a very important influence on China, right? So to compare with, the countries like India, like Chinese market's been much more open, right? So I think that is the reality, right? So China has much lower the tariff rates, right? So much less the market access restrictions, right? So I think that is true. So China is not the monolithic, right? So that is there are different opinions. They're diversified. So for example, the reforms of SOEs, and it can be a very important political issues. You can say political sensitive issues, but different people, different decision makers, they have the different approach. So I think that means China applying for the CPTPP means the reform-minded the leaders that would like to use external commitments to drive up, to speed up the domestic economic reform agenda, to continue the market economy lines. Okay, that is very important. So I think in the one article I contributed to the East Asia Forum, I call for the Washington to pay attention to the China's decision to apply for the CPTPP. That send a very important signals to the US and the world. China like to continue the reform and opening up the policies.
That's fascinating, and I want to see how Greg would sort of build on this point, especially because, Greg, you've been very engaged in recent discussions on whether the US and China can reach a little bit more of an understanding on trade issues, and you've published some important work that's drawn out of that. How do you see, especially what Wang Yong just said, and how do you think that this picture of the different frameworks that we've talked about so far, how do they all work together or not work together?
So yeah, first of all, I wanted to build on Wang Yong's important point is that we shouldn't see these two countries as billiard balls, as monoliths. Obviously we have real intensive politics in the United States regarding whether or not we should, pursue a form of a TPP or something else. And China's obviously not monolithic either. And it's very important to see the impact that the WTO had on many different aspects of Chinese reform, not just market access, but also creating more transparency within bureaucratic decision-making, enabling the center to have means to sort of look what's happening in the provinces and so forth, administrative law reform, creation of new institutions, courts, and intellectual property courts and so forth. And so clearly there's always, nothing's gonna, it's a mixed story in terms of how those work in practice, and you're still gonna get complaints from the United States and others. But at the same time, it'd be a mistake not to see the important economic reforms that took place within China and institutional developments within China. So that's number one. Number two, I think when we talk about the US not joining the TPP, we should remember that in some ways the TPP is a nexus of many different free trade agreements that, in terms of the market access component, that the United States already has in Asia. And so those continue. And so I think that's very important. What the TPP added was, a more robust sort of behind the border issues regarding labor, environment, state-owned enterprises, subsidization, and so forth. And what's quite fascinating is that China now has applied to join and saying that it's ready to meet those commitments. In addition, what was in the TPP, which we haven't talked too much about, is the digital economy. And And that you see now continued with the IPEF. The digital regulation of the digital economy is central to the trade prong of the IPEF. And here, when talks often about sort of different visions of how to regulate the digital economy, on the one hand, China being a major user in terms of trade through digital means, and the U.S. interested more in data, forbidding data localization, free flow of data, really focusing on the regulatory component of the digital economy. I think that actually, given that there's a major chapter on the digital economy in the TPP, China has signaled that there is a possibility for cooperation in this area where generally there's been a sense that these are polarized opposite approaches. And I note this in part because also national security concerns and the invocation of national security exceptions have become much more important for the United States, say, than they were 5-10 years ago during the negotiation of the TPP. So given that both sides have these national security concerns with respect to digital products and digital media, there's room for negotiation and potential cooperation in this area as well.
I want to ask.
Can I just insert? I'm just
sure. I was actually going to come right to you, Wendy,
Okay.
On this point. So please go ahead.
So look, I've listened very carefully to the last two speakers, but I feel like it's incumbent on me to insert a little reality into this discussion. And that is that the China that the United States worked with, for 15 years in the lead up to 2001 to bring into the WTO is a very different China than today. And particularly in the WTO context, and we just celebrated last year China's 20th anniversary in the WTO. China was reforming and opening, and it was led by the number 2 person in their leadership, Zhu Rongji. They were using the WTO to help them implement needed domestic reform and opening. And that was, very commendable, and it had very important results. But it didn't turn out the way that reform and opening didn't continue. And I'm not saying that it's absent now. I think when China talks about reform, it's a very different conversation than the talks about reform we were having in 2001. But when so I just put that on the table, and I've heard people say, oh, CPTPP accession is just going to be like the WTO, and it's going to embolden the reformers in China, and it's going to lead to market opening and reform. I just can't accept it. I don't totally reject it, because I think there still are reformers in China, but I think the Chinese leadership is pretty much in control of Chinese economy now. And their economic direction really goes against a lot of the CPTPP principles and obligations, including, supporting and promoting a larger role for the state, not only with respect to state-owned economies, but also with respect to state influence in private sector companies. Second, on data, one of the key breakthroughs of CPTPP was free flow of data. And the last time I looked, China isn't letting data out of its borders. So how do you square that circle? Even the most creative trade negotiator would have, problems with that. I can go on and on. I will be the first to admit China's made enormous progress with respect to intellectual property protection and enforcement, and, in other areas. But there's still a lot of areas in the IPR chapter. We haven't even talked about the labor chapter and other aspects of CPTPP that, I'm sorry, but I have a really hard time taking China's bid seriously in terms of, they really want to move in the direction of these CPTPP rules and principles. So I don't mean to be that direct, but I feel I'm on a webinar with 5 other professors. And, I live in the real world, and this is how I see it.
Well, Wendy, so that's very interesting, and I'm happy to see if any of the others want to respond. But one thing that occurred to me that might be interesting to pose to you in response to what you just said is sort of building on what Greg said at the end of his comments about how security issues are becoming bigger in our thinking about this stuff. And so I wonder if you might want to say something about that, about how national security issues were not as much part of the sort of TPP negotiations, as far as I understand it, but are now clearly front and center in the way that the U.S. is approaching sort of trade generally, and also maybe even speak a little bit to how we're talking about reform of China in terms of state-owned enterprises and subsidies, whereas at the moment the U.S. is starting to, in some ways, maybe take on a similar approach, right? Like we're starting to think about subsidizing our industries, and so it seems as if there's a couple of things happening on our side too that complicate this picture.
Well, first, I think, the whole economic security basket of issues is becoming more and more front and center in any discussion about trade or supply chains, export controls, strategic industries. And I think that could be subject of a different webinar, but it's becoming more and more important. We're also seeing in trade agreements, just overall, countries, including the United States, pointing to this national security exception. I mean, one of the reasons why the WTO worked well for many, many years was there was kind of this agreement that when if you're going to invoke a national security exception, it had to be really, really narrow. And let's just say the United States' hands are not clean here. When we invoked the national security exception for steel, we used a national security exception for steel and aluminum restrictions. So I'm not saying our hands are clean, but I couldn't agree with you more. I think the whole view of economic security and national security have also injected, an added complication to all of these agreements and initiatives. Something that I think is very important that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, in the phase 1 US-China agreement, that was one of the first trade agreements where the United States did not want a national security exception. And my understanding is the lawyers really wanted it at USTR, but that USTR Lighthizer did not want it because his view was that China would invoke it, and therefore, a lot of the so-called commitments that the United States had, secured from China would not be implemented. But I think, this is an area that's just going to complicate negotiations going further. And I couldn't agree with you more that we're taking a page out of China's playbook with respect to subsidies, with respect to looking at a national, the whole national security, economic security, exceptions or, aspects or considerations as we pursue policies. So, unfortunately, trade negotiations are so complicated as it is, but I think over the past few years, it's becoming more and more complicated. And at a time when, tensions between the United States and China are increasing and trust is at an all-time low.
That's very helpful, Wendy. Min, I definitely want to come to you to ask you how BRI and maybe even Build Back Better World fit into this picture. But just before we do that, I want to see if Wang Yong or even Dingding, if you want to say anything in response to Wendy's very interesting and provocative comments.
Well, I would certainly agree with, again, a lot of Wendy has just mentioned. I think overall, it's not just the US and China, right? It's really at the global level, security has become more and more important, very broadly defined, of course. So security is impacting everything. It's not just impacting trade, it's also finance, it's also environment, everything related to our development. That's why I think from the Chinese government perspective, there is a balance that needs to be made between security and development. Again, very broadly defined. So what is security? What is development? The boundaries are becoming, I think, blur. So that's the overall situation right now. So I think, Again, ironically, maybe US and China are becoming alike. US is taking, some lessons from the Chinese playbook, and China is trying to become CPTPP-like in some aspects. So that maybe in that sense, it's not really that bad thing, right? So we are coming to sort of a middle road, although we're still far away from that. But I think, that's the, the other question I raised. Ironically, we are actually cooperating in unexpected ways, in unexpected areas, despite the, open competition on the surface. So I'm not really completely pessimistic about the future. So going on with this question, I wanted to ask our participants.
But Dingding, just before we ask that last round of questions, I did want to give Min a chance to say something about BRI. And I think it actually fits very interestingly with your point, Dingding, about how the US started to because the Build Back Better world is in some ways like the US thinking of we should do something like BRI. So I wonder if Min can help inject those frameworks into this picture that we've been talking about so far, because sometimes I think in these conversations we forget about BRI or we forget about Build Back Better world. And so your role here is to help us understand how those things fit in these themes we've been talking about.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, they are very complicated and concurrent processes, right? So there are different strategic and economic settings across them. But I agree with Wendy that trust is very, very absent nowadays. And that's why, despite IPEF, the content of it may have relevance and instrument to China. It will be very hard for China to see as it is. Same thing, BRI, or despite its has well meaning, and part of the BRI is totally right, like the Build Back World Better is very convergent with American or the other Western interests, but it's seen as this counter strategy. I'll make a quick comment on the two appealing opposite observations, but to me they are equally correct. One is China is earnest in joining and supporting various regional institutions, including RCEP, CPTPP, and the DACA in the Digital Association in New Zealand. And if the IPEF proceeds along the line of economic regional institutions with serious discussion engagements with China, I think China is open to it. That's not because the second, Wendy says this is not going to change China. I agree. All this, the Chinese support is conditioned on how these regional institutions will help Chinese own domestic priorities and its own system, not undermining it. Right? So we have to accept both trends will be ongoing. And then the competition, the US-China in terms of regional, I always call strategy, rather than, it's so much bigger than the various economic negotiations ongoing, right? The Chinese regional strategy, BRI, is really a strategy. It has both geopolitical components, so you do have actors, agencies in China supporting, operating behind the BRI on the strategic aspect. But it's also diplomatic, stabilizing borderlines, stabilizing relationship between China and its neighbors with infrastructure, right? And then you do have significant economic components, free trade, economic corridors, investment flows. So that's just as both a manifestation of China as not a unitary actor. And a strategy needs to incorporate these major different forces. But I also see IPEF be part of the Americans' greater strategy. I think this is a complicated relationship that China is dealing with. And if America wants to engage China more deeply in the IPEF, this is something, the perception that they need to be aware. China never sees IPEF as a clean economic strategy or negotiation. It's America's new Indo-Pacific strategy, right? The strategy that was proposed, get momentum, get support because of the competition with China. And it has military component, it has diplomatic component, and the most worrisome in terms of technology and supply chains being so central to the IPEF current discussions, Taiwan will be very, very thorny issue for China to think about it. And so I think that's why it's harder for the US side and to China to have an earnest conversation on IPEF. Same thing, earnest conversation between the two on BRI, because they are seen as broader grand strategy, regional strategy, rather than economic integration.
Okay, excellent discussion. I wanted to follow up with this question. So we have talked about different frameworks and how and to what degree they're successful or not successful. But looking into the future, what do you guys see the potential of each framework? I kind of feel like we have too much, right? We have too many frameworks already out there. And I also have the feeling in the future there will be more. So I'm really kind of puzzled. Do we really need that many kind of frameworks, especially given there really a lot of overlapping, right, among them? So in the future, which ones do you think will prevail to some degree, or which ones do you think might lack momentum, sort of fade away? And in what areas? We haven't even talked about the most important issue, arguably facing our globe, right? Climate change. There's no like framework focusing more on climate change. There's this trade framework. There's this supply chain. It's really about economic development in a way, financials. But what about climate change? Can we see somewhere maybe Europe, right, regional kind of a framework? But climate change should be a very important integrated part of regional economic integration. But we don't have that. So where we have one, or in what ways can we bring back the climate issue into different frameworks? So basically, what is the future like? Will someday the US even ditch IPEF because it's not working anymore and start a new framework? That's a possibility. So I'll probably start with Greg.
Actually, Dingding, I think Wendy may need to leave soon. So maybe we should have Wendy respond, and then so she can get her final words out, and then we will wrap up with the rest of the group, if that's okay.
Please.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a great question, because one can argue if there's so many initiatives out there, how effective can any of them be? So I would hope in the medium term, someone will figure this out, and maybe you'll see some initiatives, they stay in place, but they're not really updated, and they're overtaken by new initiatives. But what worries me, though, looking ahead, and we're talking about regional economic cooperation, it's very hard for me to see like, an overarching initiative that includes the United States and China. If anything, I think we're headed towards, a proliferation of initiatives with different groupings of like-minded countries coalescing around work on different issues. So we won't even have these mega agreements. You may have like a digital group and different environmental groups and different supply chain groups. So I guess, and I don't, mean to be the pessimist here, but if, people are looking towards more harmonization and fewer initiatives, I think for the foreseeable future, we're going to see a proliferation of groupings and a proliferation of initiatives. And maybe over time, folks will realize, well, this isn't in our interest, and we'll start thinking about how do you streamline them.
Well, we still have the WTO, right? That including both China and the US.
Well, I think that's a good question as well. Yeah, maybe, under a Donald Trump, maybe not. But even if the WTO survives, I think that, the challenge is, and let's all be honest, it's becoming less and less effective in all of its core functions. And so, again, I don't think that if people think the WTO is the answer, then I think they really need to give a lot more thought to where things are headed.
Thank you, Wendy. Greg?
Sure. I just wanted to thank you, Wendy. I wanted to build on what Wendy said, and that is, the geopolitics and national security. That's a complete shift in terms of the organizing principles of U.S.-China economic relations compared to 10 years ago. But that's a broader shift, as we've discussed as well. I would say this, though, in terms of a broader sort of frameworks, there's going to be competitive frameworks, but I think there is an understanding that sort of a framework of economic integration in itself, globalization in itself, squeezing the last bit of efficiency out of global production, that's no longer the organizing principle. And the IPEF represents a shift. It's a shift that is about now resilience. Resilience in terms of how do we live on this planet regarding in relation to China, to climate change. Resilience in terms of our societies, in terms of how different segments of the society do, and this is a concern within China as well as the United States with respect to rising inequality. That certain segments of the populations benefit more than others from economic globalization. How do we ensure social solidarity within our own societies? And then it also includes, of course, security. These concerns are real, and is national. Once you invoke national security, in some ways, it's really just an invocation of sovereignty, and of course, that's a polar opposite of integration. And so, how are we going to manage these security concerns going forward? They're real. We don't want everything just to become a zero-sum game in terms of always invoking sovereignty and national security. But at the same time, we shouldn't be Panglossian. These are real concerns. And the question ultimately becomes, from the perspective of resilience of supply chains, and so forth, how do we manage this relationship in the world in which we exist today? And I think this podcast is really positive in exploring different ways so that everything doesn't become reductive in terms of conflict, but we look for ways where common ground can be reached at the same time protecting our own countries and societies.
Yeah, that's really excellent. I think we need to just find the right balance between our national boundaries, sovereignty, interests, and integration with the whole world. Professor Yemi and Wang Yong.
Yes, so I'll be quick. And I think there are different ways. So that's where, as a person who watches the Chinese, who actually reads the Chinese discourse and American discourses, I see very different logics going in both countries. So for Greg's logic of resilience and climate change, labor, environment, supply chain resilience, these are the common repeated discourses among Chinese elites. Right? So if there are decentralized and seriously fragmented discussions on those issues, I see regional, the ongoing competitive regionalism actually will bring positive sum discussion. So overall, regionalism, in my opinion, is a positive sum because inevitably it allows broader coalitions to enter the discussion and it allows middle power and smaller powers to have voices, right? But what if the other logic, the geopolitical security logic dominates? Anything that US preaches as resilience is actually crowded as or shrouded as something undercutting China's presence, right? And then the middle powers will be left without maneuvering hedging ability. And then that's another scenario. I do think there are different ways to go. And I hope this kind of leads to more exchange and more trust building conversations and go beyond the technology security and bring more climate change and labor environment. And those are the issues that can have better potential to create positive sum discussion.
Wang Yong, it looks like you have the last word here.
Okay, yeah, so I said, by now I enjoyed the discussion very much. We have touched and have discussed very important the issues to the era. Okay, we are in a new moment, the new era. So I think people talking about the side effects of the economic globalizations, right? All of us, now have, feel the or suffer, okay, from the, the sides, the influence of the globalizations, right? So that is a widening wealth gap within countries. Okay, that is imbalanced the work power. Right, so I think that is now the world has changed. So we can say the last 3 decades, we have the witness the international cooperation, the prosperity and globalizations. Right now, we might be at the at the turning point to a very different world, a different era. So talking about the future. We have the reasons building on the common interests of the last 3 decades. Okay, we still have a lot of common interests. As I said, U.S.-China, still have the largest trading partners to each others, right? Both the largest 2 economies, the nuclear powers. We have the special responsibility for the world and for the people of other countries, the people of the region and people of the world. Okay, the leaders of 2 countries should work together, okay, to figure out how to bring a stable and peaceful and prosperous the world, for the future generations, right? So, I hope, the both sides, okay, building on the common interests. To try to come together with the efforts to improve the political and trust with each other, right? They give the confidence to each other, right? To give the chance, okay, to send the regional economic cooperation framework, right? To play a role. Okay, to bring us together, not try to divide the world, what divide. So I think that is something the scholars like us and the politicians, the leaders, which think in this way, right? So how to bring the future generations to a better world. Thank you very much.
Well, it's nice to end on a hopeful and optimistic note, even though I think our conversation has illustrated that there's lots of things in the picture here, not all of it necessarily pointing in an optimistic note, but hopefully there are some strands of optimism that we can hold on to. It's been such a rich conversation. We could easily keep going for much longer, but we don't want to take up too much of everyone's time. But thank you all for joining us today. And I know that the audience will really enjoy this episode. I hope that the episode will be followed by another discussion very soon, Dingding. So we're going to have to keep these going. We have some other ideas that we're working on. So please continue to subscribe to our YouTube channel and keep an eye for what we've got stored for you in the future. But thanks again for today and goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.